Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I'm speaking to you from outside 2 Orme Square, and unfortunately it's largely boarded up. It's now a building site. That's why there's this turnstile to get in, so you can't get a very good idea of what it looks like. I'll show you the neighbouring building, and that will give you a better indication of what it looks like, as they're twin buildings. Anyway, so 2 Orme Square was the house of Jeremy Thorpe for many years. Who was Jeremy Thorpe? Well, Jeremy Thorpe is best known as having been the leader of the Liberal Party, and he's come back into the headlines recently because of that drama, A Very English Scandal, starring Hugh Grant. John Jeremy Thorpe, as he was born in London in 1929. Not in this house, but not too far away, in Kensington. His father was a barrister, Conservative Member of Parliament. His maternal grandfather had also been a Conservative Member of Parliament, known as Empire Jack. So Jeremy Thorpe grew up in a highly political family, and he had some traits of both his father and his grandfather, as in he was very self-assured, he was a gifted orator, and he identified with wider causes than simply his political party. So Jeremy Thorpe, he was evacuated to the United States during the Second World War, because he was 10 when the war broke out, and he went to school over there. He was put up by a wealthy American family who supported the Republican Party. Thorpe himself identified more with the Democrats and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it was about this time that Thorpe's father died. So Thorpe was very close to his mother, and he had a sister as well. So Thorpe came back to the United Kingdom towards the end of the Second World War to attend Eton. He only went to Eton for around 3 years. However, from someone who's from an upper middle class family, a Conservative family, it seemed to be de rigueur. And then he left Eton in April 1947, when he was still 17 years of age. He taught at a prep school briefly. Then came time for national service, as in all boys then had to do 2 years in the armed forces, unless they had some medical reason not to, or they're training, or they're studying medicine. But he had petit mal epilepsy, and he faked a major epileptic incident, because he didn't have grand mal epilepsy, but he was able to get out of doing his national service and go to Trinity College, Oxford, to read law. So he was only in the army for about 3 months. I don't think he even passed through basic training. And so he was there. He was at Oxford with George Carman, later to be a QC, and they did an exchange whereby Carman would help Thorpe with law work, whereas Thorpe coached George Carman in debating. Jeremy Thorpe, who was elected president of the Oxford Union, that's the university's illustrious debating society. Another thing about Thorpe, well, notably, by the end of the Second World War, he already identified with the Liberal Party. Wasn't quite then, obviously, the lost cause that it soon became. The Liberals only had about 18 members of Parliament. Then the 1945 election came down, they were down to 12. But they could still recover. It was a curious time because their days of might were only a generation before. They'd had a Prime Minister until 1922, Lloyd George, and incidentally, Thorpe had known Lloyd George very well as a child, to the extent that he considered him a surrogate grandfather. What else? So Thorpe, as soon as he went down from Oxford, he read for the bar, and then he was a barrister. These were fairly lean times for him, but he still managed to go on holidays abroad. Notably about Thorpe is he was actively homosexual from the 1950s, at a time when such behaviour was illegal. So he started campaigning for the Liberal Party in southwest England, and that was perhaps the only growth area for the party at the time, which by 1951 had been reduced to 6 members of Parliament out of 650 members of Parliament. So the party was always on the brink of extinction as a parliamentary party. And at one time an MP died, a Liberal MP. They were down to 5, and people quipped you could fit the entire Liberal parliamentary party into a mini. But they were hovering between existence and non-existence. So it was a very courageous and principled person who identified with them. Had he become a Conservative, a man of his prodigious talents could have gone far indeed. He managed to be elected Member of Parliament for Devon North in 1959 on his second attempt, a seat he held until 1979. Anyway, it was about 1962 that he met a stable boy called Scott, the infamous Peter Scott. What was I going to say about Scott? Norman Scott, forgive me. I say boy, he was 21 at the time. Now, homosexual acts were illegal between men of all ages. However, if it was a man over 21 with a man under 21, then the older party would have been presumed to have corrupted the younger man and would be more severely punished. And notoriously, Thorpe wrote a letter to Norman Scott in 1962, said, "I read your letter over breakfast, it gave me the most tremendous pleasure, blah blah blah, I miss you, P.S. bunnies can and will go to Paris." But anyway, his liaison with Norman Scott soon ended. Scott then went to the police, said he'd had a homosexual relationship with Thorpe. The police chose not to chase it up. But then Norman Scott was bothering for money, and Thorpe was having to find him jobs and persuade him to go away, go to France, go to Ireland, this and that. And it all came to a head in the early 70s when Norman Scott took up in North Devon, that's Thorpe's constituency, by which stage Thorpe was leader of the Liberal Party, and the Liberals were doing well. Looked like they could even be the second biggest party in the country. And Norman Scott was going around the pubs telling anyone who would listen of his former homosexual relationship with Thorpe. And the theory is that Thorpe could stand it no longer, and he received a £10,000 donation from Jack Hayward, a Briton who was living in the Bahamas. Now, £10,000 was a very substantial sum in the early 70s, but for the perennially cash-strapped Liberal Party, it was like manna from heaven. Anyway, and Thorpe gave 3 completely contradictory accounts of what he did with the money. The suspicion is that he channeled it via a friend of his in Jersey, and he used it to pay off hitmen to go and kill Norman Scott. Well, the facts of the case are this. One winter's night, Scott was persuaded to get into a car by a man called Newton in Devon. They drove, as it happened, over the county line. Newton suggested, "Why don't we get over and you can take over the driving?" They got out. Norman Scott has a huge Great Dane with him. The Great Dane was shot dead. The gunman then uttered the words, "You're next." The gun jammed and Norman Scott ran off. Did it jam? Was it failure of nerve? Was killing the dog simply a warning? Was "you're next" to mean silence or death, or rather than "I'm about to kill you now"? But anyway, that man went to prison for killing the dog and this illegal, dangerous discharge of a firearm, but he kept stum. So in 1978, Thorpe was charged with conspiracy to murder. He stood trial at the Old Bailey. He was defended by his Oxford confrère, George Carman. Now, this seemed to be the greatest theatrical event of Thorpe's life. He could take the witness stand, but he was persuaded by his brief not to speak in his own defence, as defendants are entitled to do, to be silent in court. So he couldn't be cross-examined by the defence. However, that meant he was spared cross-examination by the prosecution. Many people said that the judge was heavily biased towards Thorpe, and those who had borne testimony against Thorpe were not to be trusted. One of them was a Methodist preacher and a serial philanderer. A man had sold his story to the Daily Telegraph, and if Thorpe was convicted, this man stood to gain an awful lot more money, and therefore he clearly had a vested interest in perjuring himself to ensure that Thorpe was sent down for life. In the end, Thorpe was found not guilty. Well, Thorpe, he married in the late 60s, to many people's surprise. He had a son who's a famous photographer. He's the one who supposedly intruded into the privacy of, what's her name? The one from the Darling Buds of May, that actress, and Michael Douglas, Catherine Zeta-Jones. But then his wife died in a car crash about 1970. Then he married the Countess of Harewood, a woman who'd previously been married to the Queen's cousin, divorced from him. And this is where they lived, the house that's boarded up. So, cut a long story short, really, that was the end of Thorpe's career in 1979. He was director of Amnesty International for a month, but they received an inundation of wrathful letters complaining, saying he was utterly unsuitable for the position. So he was out of public life, and in the mid-80s he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and he retained a low profile and relative reticence until he was summoned to the gate of St. Peter in December 2014. Only then Michael Bloch's authoritative and a highly readable biography of Thorpe was published, since Thorpe had fully cooperated with this biography, but he requested the barrister Bloch that this tell-all biography not be published until he, Thorpe, had passed on. So that's that. I think he's buried in his North Devon constituency. He was always a fantasist, claiming that he was from that noble family that bore the surname Thorpe. There's no evidence that he was. Furthermore, he was from a completely different area of the country. His ancestors were. Nevertheless, he had the coat of arms of the Thorpe noble house on the order of service at his funeral, which took place at St Margaret's Church, Westminster, across the road from Parliament. What else? Yeah, his father was from Cork, where I'm from, so they'd moved from England to Ireland centuries ago, lived there for several generations, and then his father's family, they came over from Ireland to England around about 1900. Well, that is the late, great, utterly scintillating character Jeremy Thorpe. It is to my lasting regret that I never made his acquaintance.